Right, welcome everybody, and today we're going to be talking about a very controversial topic in education circles and in the education sector, and that is learning styles. I guarantee that learning styles, and I guarantee that if you've worked in the education sector for some time that you will have heard of the term learning styles quite a few times. If you read any of the textbooks about education, if you have done any courses, PDs, whatever, you will have come across learning styles to some extent. There is nothing new or spectacularly difficult about learning styles. It's been around for 50 or 60 years, and in fact, if you read some of the academic research, or what they like to call the literature, then a lot of the teaching strategies that I talk about, or well, in fact, just all of the teaching strategies really, most of them have been around for around about the 50s and 60s. Particularly the 60s is where a lot of the research, you seem to start seeing the key words or derivatives of those key words that then later go on to become teaching strategies. Some of them are a bit more modern, like flipped learning, because that really was, I guess, invented when technology made that particular strategy available as a tool to be used by teachers. So, but learning styles has been around pretty much forever. A lot of these strategies have been around for literally 2,000 or 3,000 years, since people started teaching other people in ancient Greece and Rome and all this kind of stuff. But they never had an actual name for it. So just be cautious of, not cautious, but just be wary of people trying to sell you new programs that have fancy sounding scientific names. They're all based on existing teaching strategies that educational professionals have known about and have used at least for decades. So now there are lots of different ways that we could approach learning styles. The most common one is the VAK method. Now, the reason this is the most common one, and it's not even the first one, but the reason it's the most common is because it's the most simple, at least I think it's the most simple way to understand learning styles, and that is visual, auditory, and I have to concentrate to spell this one, kinesthetic. Kinesthetic. I think that's right. It's probably the first time in my life I've ever spelled that word correctly. Also known as tactile, which just means touch. So the VAK or VAK model of learning styles is by far the most common. I quickly jumped on Wikipedia just to see what other ones were out there, and there are lots, but even Wikipedia is kind of saying that this is the way to go. And I think it serves its purpose, because learning styles has never been academically proven to be effective. So a lot of people will say, well, I'm a visual learner, or I'm an auditory learner, or I'm a kinesthetic or tactile learner, so I like to touch things and play with things, and I learn by fixing things and so on and so forth. But whenever researchers who work in this area do tests and they try and figure things out about whether visual learners are actually good at learning visually, the answer is almost always no. In fact, always no. So people who say they are visual learners do not learn any better in a visual by using visual sense, i.e. by watching something, than a person who is an auditory learner. So someone, you'll go online and there's various different tests for different learning styles. So if you do those, they're just a bit of fun, just out of interest. There's another thing called, which I've got a video on as well. Damn it. Multiple intelligences, which is very, very similar to learning styles. So, but don't let that confuse you. Sometimes you do those online tests, or you'll see them, and they're actually talking about multiple intelligences, which is slightly different, and I'll get into that in a minute. It doesn't really make any difference, because when I get to the reason for why learning styles are important, then it'll make a lot more sense as far as why the difference between the two is not really that relevant. So just remember that VAC model, and just remember that a lot of the research quite clearly says, and this is more modern research as well, quite clearly says that it really doesn't actually work. So people who say they are visual learners don't learn by watching something any more than people who say they are kinesthetic or auditory learners. When you account for factors like general intelligence, history of studying that particular topic, experience, and so on and so forth. So just bear that in mind. But anyway, so the reason why that is important is because you do not have to do lessons or activities for visual learners thinking that if I don't do something for visual learners, they won't be able to learn. If I don't do something for auditory learners, they won't be able to learn. If I don't do something for kinesthetic or tactile learners, they won't be able to learn, or their learning won't be maximized. That's completely and utterly rubbish. Now, when you go to PDs and people are talking about learning styles, they may sort of insinuate that, because there's a general assumption that people can be neatly categorized and divided into three separate different ways of learning. Probably the issue with learning styles is not so much the VAC model, but it's also in the fact that it's called learning. What it really should be called is preferred learning styles. And this is just my opinion, so you're welcome to argue it, but it really should be called preferred learning styles, because that's what it is. It's not learning styles which maximize your learning, and it's not the fact that if you've got some part of your brain means that you can only learn through a visual medium or only learn through an auditory medium, and so on and so forth. It just doesn't work that way. The research, when they look at the research, it just never ends up working out in that particular way. But why learning styles is really important for those that work in education is because it does, and particularly because of the preferred aspect of it, is it does give you a good reminder that some students prefer to learn using a visual medium, or prefer to learn using an auditory or kinesthetic or tactile medium. So some people prefer the visual, which means they are, let's just say, watching, right? Now, that can mean that could be TV, it could be a doco, could be YouTube, right? YouTube is obviously the second biggest search engine in the world for a reason, because a lot of people would consider themselves to be visual learners and spend a lot of time watching and learning things in that way. But also, YouTube is partly auditory. So auditory is really the social one. So that's listening. And this one here, by the way, I just like to add in diagrams and graphs and pictures and so forth, right? Pictures and graphs and so forth. So the visual one is about looking at something that's graphically presented. So if you read a book, visual people will prefer to go to graphs and diagrams and those types of things. Auditory is more of the social aspect, so that's listening. So that involves group work, pair work, learning from others, and that's how I like to think of that one. Learning from others, particularly in a social sense or in a social setting. So whether that's pair work, group work, doing whole of class activities. Typical extroverts are probably auditory type learners. And when I think of auditory, what comes to my mind is podcasts and those types of things. Kinesthetic and tactile, that's for people who like to fix things. Fix and tinker. Now again, that's not the exact perfect academic definition, but that's generally how I generally conceptualize and think about the kinesthetic and tactile. So kinesthetic and tactile is all about touching things. It's about having tools and having objects and props and so on and so forth. So that'll give you an idea as far as what VAC means and how it's used. And why it's difficult, you can see why it's difficult for people to be categorically categorized into one and only one of those categories, because it's very difficult to watch a YouTube video without actually listening to it, generally speaking, right? It's very difficult to fix things without learning how to fix it by maybe watching someone else fix it first. So generally, I usually say that most activities in a school environment involve more than one learning style. And how I use learning styles, and I'm kind of alone on this one because I've never heard anyone else say it, but maybe it'll catch on, or maybe I'm completely wrong, who knows. But how I use learning styles and preferred learning styles is that it gives us variation, or variety is probably a good word. Let's call it variety, actually. Variety. Variety? Yeah. Okay, so hopefully I've spelt that right. What that does is when you're doing your lesson plans, your activity plans, and you're thinking about how you're going to set up courses or how you're going to help students achieve their goals, whether that's a 5-minute activity, a 30-minute activity, or a 2-year-long course, it's worth looking at your learning styles and how you can vary up the way in which you go about teaching that particular sequence of learning or that particular activity. So, for example, if you were teaching a standard maths class, let's just say, what you might do is do 0-5. Let's say that was you were doing some modelling on the board, right? Now that modelling on the board, where does that come from? So that's visual and it's also auditory. Probably mainly visual, but if you're also doing at the same time, you'll be doing worked examples, right? So it'd probably take longer than 0-5. So worked examples and so on and so forth. Now the other thing that you might do, let's say for the next 5 minutes of your lesson, you will do a think aloud. And generally you will do think alouds at the same time as modelling, but let's, for the sake of example, say you're doing a think aloud. Now, a think aloud is just, you're doing the example on the board. Let's say you're teaching students how to write a paragraph or something, and you'll be writing it. And as you're going through and doing that, you're explaining what you're doing. This is why I've done this sentence. This is why I've used this word to join this and this. This is why, why am I using a full stop here? Why am I using a comma here? And so on and so forth. Now, let's say we do, oh, sorry, I skipped a bit, right? So let's, 10 to 20. So think alouds are quite clearly auditory. Without a doubt, they are auditory, because you also have that visual element though, but it's quite clearly auditory. Now, at 10 to 20, maybe you're going to do some type of subject-specific activity. So you may decide, well, I've done heaps of visual and auditory stuff. Let's do something kinesthetic. Kinesthetic is great for students because they get to touch things, they get to play with things, they get to manipulate it. It helps them in their brain figure things out and conceptualize things. So let's say that you pass around a whole variety of different objects and you're doing a writing activity. So let's say you pass out an object to each student. Let's say you've got 6 students. We'll call this activity object description. I should probably think of these things before I start talking about them, but no, I don't think so. Okay, so we're going to do object description. Now, what happens there is you're going to pass different objects around. It could be a ball, it could be a rock, it could be various different weird objects that you find the day before. You could get students to bring in an object, an interesting object, and they have to swap with a partner. And then that person has to write about that particular object in, say, 100 words, say a paragraph or something like that, right? So we'll call that task object description, free writing in a way. Okay, so now that is quite clearly a kinesthetic sort of tactile activity. Maybe it's also visual as well. And then let's say after that, you're going to do something of a 10-minute presentation. Right, and you're going to ask for volunteers for who was able to describe their object in very unique ways. So you'll say, you'll call for volunteers and you'll say, who here thought they did a good job and who wants to stand up and explain their work to their class. And I want you to point out specifically what you think you did good in your description and how that may apply if you had a different object, for example. And the point of that activity is maybe you're trying to get students to use different adjectives and to explain things in ever greater detail and so on and so forth. So there might be various different reasons for that, depending on what your goals are. Remembering that you always set goals at the start. So you'll have goals always float up the top there, right, of your lesson plan. And then the idea is those goals, hopefully you meet them down here. Now that presentation is going to take way longer than 10 minutes, but for the purpose of this, let's just say you choose 2 people to do a presentation and students are asking questions. Now, what is that presentation? Well, that's visual and it's auditory. So it sort of covers both. It's probably more auditory than anything else. So it gives those extroverts an opportunity. So kids with ADHD who are going to want to be centre of attention, you give them this opportunity to be a centre of attention, and helps with behaviour management. That's one of the behaviour management techniques, by the way, called giving them a job, or give them a job, give them a task. I think it's called give them a job. Yeah. Now you could make that more visual by introducing different types of props and costumes and whatever else. So there are lots of different ways that you could go about doing that activity, depending on the class and what you were trying to achieve. So with older students, you could still have those visual aspects, but it becomes more auditory. So it becomes more based on lectures if you're, say, at university or teaching adults or high school and whatnot. But that's why it's important to also add in more and more of the visual and more of the tactile, because you can still learn how to do even some of the most advanced technological things like computer programming by doing it visually and by learning the concepts on a whiteboard or whatnot. And the same with kinesthetic and tactile. So making sure it's a reminder to add those types of things in. So now, younger students do a lot of kinesthetic and tactile stuff because they engage in what is known as play-based learning quite regularly. I'm talking about early childhood here, and less of that as time goes on. So we start with doing a lot of that and we add more of this type of stuff as time goes on. Now, bearing in mind these are only preferred learning styles and they're not perfect. Obviously, there are a lot of teaching strategies that use all 3. There are a lot of teaching strategies that use 2, and it really depends on your class and not only the type of class you've got, the behaviour of your class and what you're trying to achieve. Now, I won't go any further past that, but you get the idea of how we've tried to integrate into this simple lesson all 3 into a lesson that makes it a little more interesting. Now, students who are more visual are going to be quite engaged because they can see and they can watch. Maybe you might want to even add a YouTube video in there or something like that. But either way, they are visualizing and seeing what's going on, and they can watch presentations, even if it's from their peers, for 2 minutes here or there. And the auditory, that social aspect of it, is definitely in there. And again, you've added in that kinesthetic and tactile aspect as well. So students who have a preference for either one of those 3 are catered for in that particular lesson. Okay. Now, one other point I will make is that I don't recommend that you force yourself to do the VAC model every single time. This doesn't say, or it doesn't require that if you're doing a lesson, you have to do all 3 every single lesson. This is not what the learning styles is all about. It is simply a reminder that some students prefer to watch, listen, learn by, say, watching a YouTube video, whereas others will prefer to be in social groups. And some students are very strongly visual, some are very strongly more social / auditory, some are very strongly kinesthetic or tactile. So another way to think of tactile is gross motor, I guess. or even fine motor, really. Yeah. So these types of students will enjoy woodwork, for example. Okay, now that's basically learning styles. We were talking about multiple intelligences, which is a separate video, just to think about the differences between learning styles and multiple intelligence, because that's something that people often get quite confused. They are different theories of learning, or there are different ways of categorizing the way in which people learn and are able to achieve learning goals. Multiple intelligences is a little different in that instead of having 3 learning styles, multiple intelligence, there are, I think, 10 off the top of my head. It does change depending on which model that you're looking at and whether it's the original model or the newer model. But I'd recommend watching the video about that. And again, not being too concerned. Multiple intelligence basically says that some students can be intelligent in some areas, such as musical. They can be very, very talented and gifted in that area, but not as intelligent, I guess, when it comes to, say, mathematics. Now, the multiple intelligence method basically is saying that an IQ, so you've got IQ, which typically measures someone's ability to solve basic problems and things. The idea is that you can have an IQ for these 10 or 11 different areas. So you can have a music, I think nature, mathematical, I think it's mathematical, logical, and so on and so forth. So naturally, I mean not naturally, classically, say a person has an IQ of 100. So that's their 100 is the average IQ. But mathematical or logically, that person might have an IQ of 90, which is below average. Music, they might be 95, but a nature or natural sort of IQ, they may be 110. So people's IQs differ depending on the type of intelligence that we're talking about. So that's just a different way of thinking about intelligence and learning and things like that. Now, I just want to write and talk about one final thing when it comes to this particular topic. I think that pen doesn't really work very well, and that is this. Right, hopefully you can see that because this one's not going too well either. Differentiation. Multiple intelligences and learning styles, as I was saying before, it gives us the ability to differentiate. And what that basically means is that if students have a preference for learning using a visual medium, then why not give them what they would like to do and how they would like to go about doing it? If students have a preference for a kinesthetic or tactile medium or way of learning, then it makes sense to try and integrate more of that into the lesson plan or into the activity, particularly if there are behavioural issues. And the same with multiple intelligence. If a student has a higher mathematical or logical intelligence, then adding more of that into an activity is obviously going to motivate that student more. You're going to get a higher level of productivity, more on-task time, less resistance to learning and completing tasks, things like that. If you're doing a bit of an emphasis on that sort of type of intelligence. Whereas if a person has a bit of a preference for music and learning through music, and it could be singing or anything like that, then even in a science class or a technology class or an English class or whatever, adding more things that relate to music is going to help that student as well. So again, we're then differentiating our curriculum and our teaching strategies and our teaching style and our approach and our resources based on our understanding of learning styles and based on our understanding of multiple intelligences. Okay, so please watch the video on multiple intelligence if that's something that appeals to you. And just remember, as a quick summary, that the VAK model is the most popular model in terms of learning styles. It stands for visual, auditory, and kinesthetic or tactile. It is not the only model, but it's the most popular one. I wouldn't worry about learning any other ones, but it is only a preference. And I think you should think of learning styles in terms of preferred learning styles. So it is not required learning styles or the only learning styles, because students don't fit into that 100%. So they're not purely, I can only learn by watching TV documentaries and YouTube. I could not possibly learn by doing anything. That's just not the case. It just doesn't work like that. And the other thing to bear in mind as a final thought is the research does quite clearly show that people who say they are visual learners learn just as well kinesthetically or auditory or using the auditory method. Again, it's all about preference. So what people say they are or people they think they are, that is their preference. They still have the intellectual capability to learn using various other means as well. Also, of course, factoring in experience. If you've spent a lot of time learning using this method, then you're obviously going to be probably better at it and feel more comfortable learning that particular way. So that's everything about learning styles that I can think of. Thank you for watching.